Denver Broncos hired a new running back coach, which could mean they could be looking at several options in free agency or the NFL draft, plus George Paton, Sean Payton. They're in Indianapolis for the NFL Scouting Combine. We tell you why it's a big week ahead for the Broncos. You get that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode of Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in and making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format, or whether you watch on YouTube. Mile high salute to everybody in Broncos country. Thank you for helping us reach 9K subscribers here on YouTube. Our goal for the season or through the season is to get to 10K. So thank you so much to all of you who watch us on YouTube as well. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host and my good friend, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Sayre, 9K subscribers is huge. Another thing that is huge for the Broncos this week, it's the NFL Scouting Combine. Sean Payton, George Paton, they're going to be there. But Denver also filled their running back coach position, which was something that we were looking forward to seeing how it was going to happen and maybe what it means for the Broncos offense.
That's right, Cody. The Broncos hired Lou Ayeni, a running backs coach from Northwestern, the college program. So worked for Pat Fitzgerald. They're a very well-respected coach in the football community, whether you're talking NFL, NCAA. So worked there for a few years. Before that, worked at Iowa State, had a number of different jobs along the way, of course, and very experienced in the running game, not just running backs coach, but he's served as run game coordinator at some of his different stops. You know, he's been on the recruiting trail pretty heavily, and maybe some of those connections that he made at the college level, those could come into play here, Cody, as we talk about NFL free agency coming up, and what a more perfect time to have somebody in your building with connections than right before the NFL Scouting Combine, where we know a lot of these deals get talked about, a lot of teams talking to agents, talking about players, this, that, and the other, getting ready for free agency here in just a couple of weeks where, hey, maybe the Broncos could be some players at the running back spot.
I think that's the question we've been asking ourselves, right? And I think ESPN's Jeff Legwold touched on it, I think a few weeks ago, saying that, hey, Javonte Williams is not necessarily expected to be back, maybe even through a good portion of the 2023 season. You and I have been huge advocates here on this show of saying, hey, do not rush Javonte back. It gives the Broncos an idea to go through and maybe look at the free agency market. I know it's always an option in the NFL draft, but considering Denver has such limited draft capital, I don't know if running back's going to be on their high totem pole in the draft cycle. That's the perfect means for free agency. As you mentioned, Coach Lou, as we're going to call him here. I don't want to butcher his last name here, but some guys that he's coached before, David Montgomery, a longtime veteran. Also, Kareem Hunt, who is dynamic out of the backfield as a pass catcher, as an explosive runner. He's kind of that combination, a little bit of the both. And he kind of really took a back seat to Nick Chubb, who, as we've seen, there are only a couple running backs in the NFL who really have that workhorse load. Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Nick Chubb can be another example there. Kareem Hunt set to become a free agent as well. I mean, we've also talked about Latavius Murray. In your opinion, considering that the Broncos now have an offensive coordinator in Joe Lombardi, who's not going to be calling plays, Sean Payton will be, but with Sean Payton's direction, new running back coach and Coach Lou, I mean, I think you have to look at pre-existing relationships when we talk about free agency and also personnel.
I definitely think you do, right? Even when considering Joe Lombardi, right? Because the last 2 years, I mean, I think Austin Eckler just scored another touchdown. Cody, what did he have, like 75 over the last 2 seasons? To Joe Lombardi's credit, I mean, I don't think Justin Herbert was out there calling the offensive plays with the Chargers. I don't think he was necessarily, I don't think Joe Lombardi necessarily deserves no credit for the Chargers having a top 5 offense in 2021. Yeah, they took a bit of a step back in 2022. Of course, when Keenan Allen missed, how many games, and they had a number of injuries there. So I think it's very interesting, this running back position, the situation, the fact that you just hired a running backs coach who, hey, he just so happens to have coached David Montgomery to an All-American season at Iowa State. Kene Nwangwu of the Minnesota Vikings. Cody, speaking of butchering last names, I probably just butchered his as well, but he was a freshman All-American under this guy. Then you obviously have the Kareem Hunt ties. He recruited him to Toledo back in the day. And actually, I was reading, there's a great bio on this guy on the Northwestern Athletics site. People should go check it out. They actually mentioned that he was a mentor to Kareem Hunt there. So maybe a healthy situation for Kareem. I know that a lot of people just opposed to the idea of him based on his past, which totally get that. So that'll be interesting to see. But also John Morton coming aboard the coaching staff as the passing game coordinator. He has some significant ties to free agents as well. Obviously coached in Detroit this past year, where he's connected to Jamal Williams, who had 17 touchdowns. And then the years before that, 2019 to 2021, he was with the Raiders, the organization. And he started there the year they drafted Josh Jacobs. And we've heard plenty of rumors about him as well. So I just think there's too many things out there right now, too many ties between the Broncos and free agent running backs, Cody, for something not to happen.
I think the writing is on the wall, right? And we're putting on the tinfoil hats. Maybe we've got a little bit of a mission room somewhere, and we've got all these sticky notes with the strings and the little pins attached to the wall. We're going crazy when it comes to this. I'm all for that. I think you always have to look at options. I think Latavius Murray will be back regardless. I think the relationship that he and Sean Payton have, I think that's crucial. We saw him play well last season for the Broncos. He could protect the football. He's a shoo-in. And if let's say Javonte misses the entire season this upcoming year, which could potentially be an option for the Broncos, I necessarily wouldn't be opposed to it if it means that he's going to come back in 2024 110% healthy, right? I think you have to look at all of these things from a 30,000-foot perspective. You do have to find guys in the meantime that can come in and do that. And you always have to be looking ahead, right? While you always focus on the present, there's always an eye on the future as to, okay, how do we maneuver at this position? What might we run into with this position? And as we've seen, I mean, running back position is one of those areas that is consistently dealing with contact. You got guys that are running in between the trenches, getting their foot stepped on by offensive linemen, sometimes defensive linemen, getting hit by a linebacker or a safety. It is a punishing position to play, and you need options. I think you really need 3 guys on the roster, and while Denver has some guys that are currently, some moves could make a massive amount of difference in terms of what the Broncos actually decide to do. I like the ties to John Morton. I think he's had a lot of success as a coach. He was well regarded on Dan Campbell's staff. Some Lions fans were saying, hey, this is a big loss for Dan Campbell, and not only that, for the Detroit Lions offense, which put up points at an astronomical rate last year. He'll be the passing game coordinator, as you mentioned. I'm excited to see what's going to happen here with the Broncos offense. Maybe what they can build, the offensive line, and hopefully it leads to more points scored in 2023. But Broncos country, one of the things we're excited for, part of the formula before you get to NFL free agency, is the NFL Scouting Combine. Sayre and I, we're excited about the NFL Scouting Combine. Despite Denver not having a first or second round pick, why should Broncos fans be glued into the NFL Scouting Combine this week? We'll tell you that and much more on today's episode of Locked On Broncos. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Built Bar, and as you know it, the best tasting protein bar that is out there on the market today. And if you want a combination of something that contains 100% milk chocolate but is actually healthy for you, Built Bar is the place to be. They have regular Built Bars. They have the Built Bar Puff Bars, which contain marshmallow fluff, and it's soft and easy to chew. Each bar contains 17 grams of protein, 130 calories, and only 4 grams of sugar. You could get some at Built.com, but if you have a Walmart or a Sam's Club nearby, you can get a box today. Go to your local Walmart or the pharmacy area, and you can get a box of 4 Built Bars today. Or if you want to buy in bulk, go to Sam's Club and thank Locked On Broncos later. The NFL Scouting Combine is a big week for the rest of the National Football League, including the Denver Broncos. Even though they don't have a first-round pick or a second-round pick, we'll tell you why it's important. Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format. Sayre, this is a big week, not only from an NFL draft and the Broncos scouting department side of things, but this is a big week because so much gets done at the NFL Scouting Combine, right? The offseason, everyone talks about the Senior Bowl, the Shrine Bowl, and then you get to Indianapolis where a lot of conversations are had by a lot of powerful people in the NFL world with other teams, agents are present, and players are even around. So this is a huge time and a big week for the Broncos, George Paton, and Sean Payton. But more importantly, let's look at it first from the NFL draft side of things. When looking at guys who are testing this week, what positions should Broncos country have their eye on as it pertains to, hey, you should maybe watch this guy or, this position group run because this is where Denver is in the market for?
Well, I think number one, you want to start kind of with the big uglies in the trenches, right? I think that's where the Broncos have a lot of their needs right now, whether you're talking about basically the entire offensive line, maybe all over the defensive line. I know you've mentioned this before. Yoma Uwazurike, don't sleep on him. DJ Jones coming back. He's a good player. Vance Joseph, a big fan of obviously Deshaun Williams. Remember, he was originally brought to the Broncos back when Vance was the head coach of the team. So I think there's guys there that could be considered solid depth, but maybe look to that position group to say, hey, we feel like this guy has starter upside here. We found Dre'Mont Jones in round 3 once upon a time, right? So maybe you find somebody else, another gem there in round 3 where the Broncos have their first couple of picks in this draft. But offensive line going to be a very big focus. I just don't know. Do you go into the third round of the draft needing a starter on the offensive line? I don't know if that's necessarily the best practice. I know a lot of fans want to say, hey, let's pigeonhole the offensive line into that spot. But I wouldn't necessarily plan on doing that, even though, hey, maybe the best player in that slot is going to be offensive line. But you know me, Cody, I'm a sucker for the skill guys.
No, I think we all are. And I think for where Denver is at, right, the NFL Scout and Combine, in my opinion, when you approach the NFL draft, I think you and I have said it, and I think this is how George Paton has operated, and I think even Sean Payton to an extent. You never draft based on need, right? Usually if you're in the top 10 or like the top 5 picks, you maybe do draft best player available based on need there. But where Denver is at, you have to address some of these major needs in free agency. That's going to be the most pivotal part there. And as we talk about, for example, running back, we spoke on it last segment there. I think Denver also should keep an eye on the wide receiver group here in this year's NFL Scout and Combine leading up to the draft because, as always, while you want to focus on the present, you always have to have your eye on the future. And with the wide receiver room in general, Jerry Jeudy's in a contract year. This is a big year for him. You have Courtland Sutton and Tim Patrick's coming off of an injury. KJ Hamler is coming off of an injury. This is where you may say, okay, hey, we're going forward with these guys, but we need to keep our eye on potentially the future.
You do. You got to, even if you do plan on this wide receiver group kind of staying the same for 2023, right? If you bring back Tim Patrick from the injury, you get Courtland Sutton in the mix again, Jerry Jeudy, you say, hey, we'd rather take a shot on 1 year of KJ Hamler than send him somewhere for a late round pick. Maybe your wide receiver room looks really similar in 2023 as it was in 2022, but you do plan for the future there and look to this draft class where I think a lot of people would probably agree, maybe not the most top heavy wide receiver position, but like in a lot of recent years, very good depth at this wide receiver position. So I think that's an area where George Paton, the scouting department, they're going to have to really put some hay in the barn because this position is so important. It's becoming increasingly more expensive, and you don't want to be caught in a situation in 2024 where, man, we couldn't come to a deal with Jerry Jeudy, and KJ Hamler, he still struggled with injuries, and Tim Patrick didn't quite look as good as we thought coming back, and Courtland Sutton still. I'm not saying everything's going to go bad, but I am saying that you plan for any of those contingencies by 2024. You can't assume all these guys are going to be back then. So wide receiver, skill positions in general, running back as well, even though we talked about free agency there, I think those are spots in that third round that historically have provided really great value to teams. Maybe the Broncos dip into that receiver pool early this year after, I was begging for it last year.
I think what you mentioned too, especially like some of those hypotheticals about Broncos wide receivers already on the roster, I feel like that would be like worst case scenario, right? So it's like the outlook isn't bad at all. Best case scenario, all these guys stay healthy and then they ball out and you say, okay, you know what? They've got a really good group here. And then maybe if you do go with another wide receiver in the draft at some point, you say, okay, this is a guy who maybe can step into a role a couple years down the line, right? Continued development. We always talk about it. We are big proponents of player development. And I think Sean Payton is, and the staff that he's assembling, I think have some emphasis on player development. I think that's a huge key for them, and we'll see how things go. But another area that I think they need to take a look at, the defensive backs. Now, for me personally, I love watching the defensive backs test at the NFL Scouting Combine because you get to see things like footwork. You get to see hips, and you get to see, can they catch the ball, especially when they do some of those reaction drills. But mainly, this is where you see guys and their elite athletic traits, right? We talk about testing. We talk about RAS, relative athletic score. Shout out to our man Kent Platt for that. This is where all that comes to fruition, and it gets all of us excited. It gets George Paton excited. To me, I think that considering the background of Sean Payton and even a guy like George Paton, I think defensive back will be crucial, and you do have a proven coach who has already shown that he can develop DBs into players.
And that's what you want to do in the NFL draft is get players for your best position coach, right? I think that's a no-brainer for the Denver Broncos. We've seen in 2 draft classes for George Paton, Pat Surtain, Caden Stearns, Damari Mathis. Those guys, all 3 look like legit future potential starters in the defensive backfield. And what do they all have in common? They've all worked under Christian Parker in that defensive backfield, and they all have high RAS scores, right? They're very, very good athletes in the defensive backfield and players that I think you can build around. So look for more of that. As the Broncos don't pick until round 3, that doesn't necessarily matter all that much. You found a starter in Damari Mathis in round 4, right? So you could certainly find somebody at pick number 68 or 69 overall there, if it's the direction the Broncos want to go. And safety, Cody, could be an underrated area that this team looks at as well. Maybe even corner, depending on what happens with Ronald Darby. Does the team bring back K'Wan Williams under Vance Joseph? So could be some interesting things happening here as we progress closer to the draft. Of course, we'll know more after free agency happens, what the team could be looking to do in the draft, but interesting nonetheless. And I'd say focusing on these position groups, which are all increasing in price every year for NFL teams, focus on these position groups to get guys on rookie deals.
You want to try to maximize that value, especially as you mentioned, the markets for all these positions continue to reset year in and year out. The NFL Scouting Combine is very exciting for the fact you get to see potential future Denver Broncos, but it's also exciting because you get some rumblings about in-house Denver Broncos free agents, where agents meet with executives all the time at the NFL Scouting Combine. What does that mean for the Broncos and Dre'Mont Jones and some other free agents? You'll get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Just want to say thank you so much for tuning into the Locked On Podcast Network. We have a Locked On Podcast show for you. If you're a Colorado sports fan, you're listening to Locked On Broncos right now. We also have a Locked On Nuggets podcast, a huge win over the weekend against the Los Angeles Clippers as Nikola Jokic continues to cement his status as a potential back-to-back-to-back MVP. Adam Adams and Matt Moore have you covered with all the pick and roll action on the Locked On Nuggets podcast. We have the Locked On Rockies podcast with spring training coming up, the Locked On Avs podcast as they look to get healthy at just the right time, the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This week at the NFL Scouting Combine, free agents for the Denver Broncos who are set to become unrestricted, restricted, or even exclusive rights free agents. A lot of their representation will be in Indianapolis because agents have clients that are going to be performing and testing in front of many NFL teams and also interviewing with various NFL teams. Thank you so much, Broncos country, for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you so much for tuning in. As we talked about previously, the excitement about watching potential future prospects, this is also a big week for the Broncos, who have some tough decisions to come up with free agency. We mentioned all the guys that are going to be unrestricted, various restricted guys like Brett Rippon, PJ Locke, and then you have the exclusive rights guys like Jonas Griffith. Outside of that, the biggest name unrestricted free agent for the Broncos between now and that March 7th deadline for franchise tag is Dre'Mont Jones, and the Broncos are working on negotiating. They're talking with Dre'Mont's agent, and those talks are expected to ramp up a little bit this week in Indianapolis.
Great news for Broncos fans and anybody who wants to see Dre'Mont Jones back in orange and blue, right? Obviously, he is the team's biggest name free agent, not just biggest name. He's their best free agent. He would be one of the best players, I think, to hit the market regardless of team or position. Mike Kliss, our good friend at 9 News, he's reporting that they've already negotiated, like you mentioned, Cody, a little bit, although he said no deal, nothing is imminent, but the plan is for the Broncos to get with Jones's agent, who just so happens to be former Denver Broncos player Kyle McCarthy. Remember him, the old safety? So I'm optimistic as I've ever been about Dre'Mont Jones. There was a time there where I kind of felt like maybe, I don't know, maybe the writing is sort of on the wall. Maybe he wants more than the Broncos are willing to offer. Maybe he just doesn't really want to play in Denver. I think he's done his part to kind of dispel those rumors. He took to Twitter. I don't know if you saw that. I'm sure everyone saw that, but he took to Twitter and said how much he loves playing for the Broncos, how he'd love to be there. He said all the things, you typically see guys say before leaving free agency or potentially leaving in free agency. So it was at least good to see him come out and say those things. I guess we'll kind of see what price do the Broncos have in mind for Dre'Mont Jones. Is there a line that they've drawn in the sand, and what could that line potentially be?
Well, and I think a lot of the questions, right? We've seen numbers floated out there like 14.5 million, 15 million, 16. We've even seen 20 million. And I think where you look at this roster construction, Denver probably has a lot of money right now invested in the defensive side of the ball. And I think we've all been on the understanding they have to shift some of that to the offensive side, considering how the offense has performed, which is crazy. I mean, Denver's one of the least invested financial teams on the offensive side of the ball. I mean, minus Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson has a bigger portion of that, Sayre, for Denver. So how they do a lot of this is going to be very interesting. But I think in terms of Dre'Mont, you have to look at what he's done, right? And yes, I know that some fans, and I know that a lot of people say, well, Dre'Mont hasn't stayed healthy. He has never finished a full season there. I mean, injuries are part of the game. We talk about running backs playing a very physical position. Well, the defensive line, the offensive line, trench warfare is one of the most grueling positions to play in all of pro sports. It's the most physical that you get. And sometimes you get sandwiched in between two offensive linemen. You get stepped on. I mean, there's so many different things. And Dre'Mont, his issue was a hip, right? And so that stuff is fixable with, physical therapy, rehabilitation, things like that. Luckily, he did not have to get surgery. So I think that bodes well for where he's at entering free agency. And for Denver, I think you have to ask, okay, what does Dre'Mont do really well? We've discussed it. Pressuring the quarterback. He's almost, I think he's led the team a majority of the last 3 seasons in quarterback pressures, despite not starting his first 2 seasons in the NFL, not being a sole starter for an entire year. He started and played in all 13 games this season, missed the Final Four with the injury, and he had 6.5 sacks. So he's still been able to match his career high in the sack department from playing a defensive end position. Usually, your outside guys, your edge rushers, those are the ones that are normally projected, unless you're Aaron Donald, to get double-digit sacks. So I'd say Dre'Mont is pretty much par for the course for what that position expectation is. And I don't know what his value is. I don't know. I'm not going to negotiate his contract, but you have to ask yourselves, like, Sayre, if you were George Paton, what would your line be here with Dre'Mont?
I just don't know if I'd go up to 20 million a year. I mean, that's a tough price to pay for just about any position group, right? You don't see that a ton in the NFL. I mean, you see it more nowadays with wide receivers, like we mentioned, with certain edge players, quarterbacks, of course, corners at times as well. But I mean, that's a tough one because you really value Dre'Mont Jones highly. It's just hard to know exactly what the market value is for a guy like him at this point in time, or is he going to help reset the market below players like Aaron Donald, like you mentioned, and Chris Jones? Like, is he on that tier as a playmaker on the defensive line right now, or are you going to pay him to become that? I guess I don't know exactly where the Broncos are at, but I think what's important to note here is that let's say they do sign him to a $15 million per year deal or $16 million per year. What's important for fans to understand is that's not going to just suck your salary cap dry. They structure these deals so that the year one cap hit can be a little bit lower so that you can have the flexibility to make other moves. So don't have to necessarily worry, even if it does get up to 20 million a year. It's not like Dre'Mont is going to cost 20 million against this year's salary cap, unless he's franchise tagged, of course. But if they get a multi-year deal done, no need to worry right away that, oh my goodness, this is going to cost 20 million against the cap. The Broncos have no cap space to make other moves. That's not the case. They structure these things out so that they can be able to make other moves. And I do think with no first or second round pick, this team has to be very aggressive in free agency to fill needs, to address weak areas, to do all these things. So it's not like they're going to set themselves up to be in trouble roster-wise, especially in year one under Sean Payton.
And I think you have to ask yourself, are you better with or without Dre'Mont Jones? And I think when you look at the tape, man, you see how physically dominant he is, right? And everyone's like, well, he didn't have 10 sacks. You can't just look at everything and quantify it based on sacks. We talk about quarterback pressures. I think that needs to be highlighted even more going forward. I'll say this, I don't care about PFF grades. I don't invest in that because what it is you have guys who get a copy of a game and they're grading without even knowing what a player's responsibility is. You have a multitude of players that'll come out and say something against it. But, the ones that have high grades, they usually don't say anything against PFF. But, not to take a shot at them, but, we got to stop looking so much into PFF as the end-all, be-all of everything. Look at the tape. The tape doesn't lie. Dre'Mont, when healthy and when in a position, I think with good pieces around him as well, makes the Broncos even better. And I think that we're going to see that. And I think the thing that takes the longest, Sayre, with some of these contracts, realistically speaking, how long have we been told? It's usually the framework, right? What it looks like year one, what it looks like year two, what does the bonus look like, maybe in year three? How does it look on a per game roster bonus, things like that? What about the offseason incentives? These are the things that take a lot of time to realistically figure out. We saw it with Justin Simmons' contract extension that Denver gave him. That's really what took the longest, was just getting all the framework together. So there is time, and Denver has until March 7th to, realistically think okay, hey, we're either going to extend Dre'Mont, and if we can't get to terms just yet, we'll franchise tag him, and we'll work to negotiate by that July 15th deadline to get him on a long-term deal in Denver. I know a lot of people look ahead and say, well, don't pay him $20 million a year on the franchise tag. You're hoping you don't have to if you can get to the point where come July 15th or before that, you sign him to an extension. If, in fact, worst case scenario, this takes a little bit longer. But one thing is for certain, Broncos country, we have you covered every step of the way, every single day here, breaking down all the latest in the Valley, covering the Denver Broncos. Locked On Broncos is the place to be. I just want to say thank you so much for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day every single day. George Paton, Sean Payton are set to meet with the media on Tuesday to talk about a wide variety of maybe some of the team's needs, some latest rumblings. We'll have all the reaction and more here on the Locked On Broncos podcast.